Hello, my name is Lucy Tatam. Today I'm going to be talking to you about my study on LGBTQ plus influence and representation in counsellor training curricula. This presentation is also going to focus on intersectionality, both on how it sort of interacts with the LGBTQ plus community, but also on its importance and its relevance in including it in training. Minority stress theory shows us that if you identify as part of a minority community, like the LGBTQ plus community, you're automatically more likely to experience added stresses in your life because of things like discrimination and things like homophobia as well. This, as well as other factors, means that LGBTQ plus individuals are a lot more likely to struggle with their mental health. They're more likely to struggle with things like depression, anxiety, and as well with suicide and suicidal ideation. In addition to that, this community are a lot more likely to experience abuse, both verbal abuse, physical abuse, and sexual abuse as well. All of this combined means that this community are a lot more likely to access counselling, and they actually access it at a much higher rates than heterosexual populations. This means that there's sort of a need for counselling within this community and a demand as well. Despite all of this, over half of this community feel like services aren't adequate or that they could be improved. LGBTQ plus competency training in counselling. A lot of counsellors and trainee counsellors take part in inclusivity and diversity training or LGBTQ plus competency training, and it's being suggested that this training should be mandatory for counsellors to attend to. Despite this, many people feel that whilst it improves their knowledge, it doesn't consistently translate into practice quality. In fact, some counsellors and trainee counsellors feel like their awareness decreases after they've completed this training, so they know less. On top of that, quite a lot of counsellors feel like they learn more from personal interactions. So from talking to people that have lived experience, that are part of this community, and they feel like they learn a lot more from people sort of that they know personally. This really suggests that lived experience is really, really essential for when we learn how to work with this community and indeed any sort of minority community. It also suggests that training isn't necessarily efficient. It's not helping people learn in the same way that they are from personal interactions and from people that have lived experience. Now, quite a lot of research on counsellor training for this community has asked counsellors' perspectives on what they would like to learn about in training. A lot of researchers also looked at like LGBTQ plus clients' perspectives on what they would like from their counsellor and what they would like to see in counsellors. However, there's very limited research that asks this community what they would actually like to see in training and what their current perspectives are on training that's been presented currently. So the aim of this study. There are three main aims of this study, and these are to explore the LGBTQ plus community's perspectives on current counsellor training, so what they think sort of or what their opinions are on what kind of training counsellors are currently receiving, to explore the LGBTQ plus community's perspectives on the competency of counsellors if they've been to counselling, and how effective they think their counsellors were at working with them, and also to explore this community's perspectives on what they think should be included in training. The goal of this is to inform training development directly from lived experience perspectives. As we saw in the last slide, this lived experience is showing to be really essential in learning how to work with this community. And so providing that lived experience perspective on training could be really important to help training translate into effective practice. Essentially, we're asking what this community wants to see included in training, and in sort of in turn what they want to see their counsellors trained in and able to work with. For this study, we designed a mixed methods online questionnaire on the SCI toolkit. This consisted of 19 questions, and these questions were closed questions, open questions, and also Likert scale questions. Some of these questions were designed for members of the LGBTQ plus community who hadn't attended counselling to see what the barriers were to not going to counselling. And some of these questions were designed for members of the community who had attended counselling to see what their experience of counselling had been. This questionnaire was completed by 61 members of the public who identified as part of the LGBTQ plus community, and these participants were recruited through both Sona and social media. Prior to completing the questionnaire, participants read through an information sheet which detailed information about the study, our ethical approval by Bangor University, and also made them aware of the fact that they could skip any question if they didn't wish to answer, and also made them aware of who to contact should they feel the need to. They then signed a consent form to show that their participation was voluntary and to show their understanding of what the study was. And then once they'd completed the questionnaire, they also read through a debrief sheet. And here any support resources were provided, just in case any questions in our questionnaire had caused distress for our participants. So let's look at the results. When participants were asked how well covered they perceived certain aspects of the LGBTQ plus community was in training, they rated asexual and aromantic identities as the least well covered. When asked to rate how important specific topics within training were, they rated trauma-informed approaches as the most important. Towards the end of the questionnaire, there were two qualitative questions that asked about training and what would like to be included in training. There were four main themes that came out of this. First of all was awareness of identity and also the diversity in identity, such as asexual and aromantic identities. Second of all, stigma and social inequality. And thirdly was family and social context, specifically looking at things like religion and coming out as well. This is really interesting as well when you look at the fact that this community have rated trauma-informed approaches as the most important topic. Finally, and the final theme was therapist competence and affirming practice, which means just the fact that therapists are able to work with this community in a safe and comfortable way. So the first graph on this slide shows how important participants rated counsellors receiving LGBTQ plus training on a 5-point Likert scale, from not at all important to extremely important. The second graph on this slide looks at the importance of counsellors identifying as part of the LGBTQ plus community on the same Likert scale, from not at all important to extremely important. As you can see, there's a significant difference between the two, and actually the importance of counsellors receiving LGBTQ plus training was significantly more important than them identifying as part of the LGBTQ plus community. Participants, as part of this questionnaire, were asked to rate how important they felt 8 different counsellor training topics were. These topics were addiction, LGBTQ plus competency, grief, disabilities and neurodiversity, cultural competence, specific mental illness, age-related issues, and poverty. As we can see in this table, addiction was rated as the most important topic for counsellors to be trained on, with LGBTQ plus competency second and grief third. And so this sort of population, I suppose, felt like these were the 3 core things that counsellors needed to be aware of and be trained on how to work with. With post-hoc comparisons comparing LGBTQ plus competency's importance to the rest of these topics, LGBTQ plus competency was found to be rated significantly more important than specific mental illness training on age-related issues and on poverty, but not significantly more important than addiction, grief, disabilities and neurodiversity, and cultural competence. So if we look at the results as a whole, Participants consistently emphasise that the LGBTQ plus identity interacts with trauma and traumatic experiences, addiction, grief, family relationships, and social inequality. And that this is something that they feel like counsellors need, these are things that they feel like counsellors really need to be aware of in addition to the LGBTQ plus identity. This, to me, I suppose, really suggests that training should be embedded um, within topics. So LGBTQ plus perspectives and training shouldn't just be an add-on or like a 2-day course, but actually embedded within these topics when you learn about grief, when you learn about addiction, and when you learn about trauma. What do these results show us? I think first of all, it shows that intersectionality is a core theme in training and is really important to the LGBTQ plus community. They show that this community doesn't feel like their identity exists in isolation to other parts of their identity, such as religion, such as family, and also doesn't exist in isolation to other aspects of their mental health. Instead, this community feels like their experiences are overlapping and their identities are overlapping, and that there's sort of quite a complex, I suppose, connection between all of this that needs to be addressed and needs to be worked on in training. In particular, participants prioritise training linked to addiction, grief, and trauma. Addiction is often used as a coping mechanism for people that are struggling to survive, struggling to cope. People get addicted to substances that provide them with momentary relief when they're struggling to cope. When we look at minority stress theory and the idea that this community are experiencing added stresses both internally from struggling to accept themselves and struggling to come to know themselves, and also from internal fear of what people are thinking of them or of what homophobia they're going to experience, as well as externally from homophobia, from discrimination, it becomes as no surprise that addiction can be a big part of this community. And it comes as no surprise that participants then want addiction to be prioritised in training and want addiction and that the interaction between addiction and their identity to be prioritised in training. Participants also prioritised grief. Now, the concept of disenfranchised grief is relatively new to me, but it discusses the idea of unrecognised loss. So, loss and grief that isn't necessarily recognised from the wider society, such as loss of a pet. But for this community, I think it can encompass a different kind of loss in a way. It can encompass loss of your previous identity or your previous self. For example, when you're transitioning, or also when you're coming to sort of understand your identity a bit more and you're losing that person you used to be. Participants want this idea of grief and how that interacts with their identity to be prioritised in training. Finally, participants prioritised trauma and training on how to work with trauma within the results and within the questionnaire. Again, this comes as, I suppose, very little surprise and is very understandable as to why they want this to be prioritised. Again, as we discussed in the introduction, this community are a lot more likely to experience abuse of different kinds, as well as homophobia and discrimination. And so this training on trauma and how to work with trauma is understandably very important for this community. So how do we embed and work with intersectionality in future training? First of all, this community wants training on intersectionality and on LGBTQ plus competency to integrate trauma-informed approaches, addiction, and potentially better coping mechanisms, grief and family rejection, stigma, discrimination, and minority stress, as well as family, religious, and social concepts. They want all of this to be embedded into training on how to work with this community. They also identified a few training gaps. This community showed that they felt there was a limited focus on intersectionality in training and how their identity as part of the queer community interacts with other aspects of identity and mental health, like grief and addiction. They also showed that there was and highlighted that there was an underrepresentation of diverse LGBTQ plus identities in training. This community felt like aspects of their identity, like being aromantic or asexual, aren't included in training and aren't represented. Finally, and I suppose the way to integrate intersectionality into training is, instead of treating LGBTQ plus topics as an add-on, integrate it into training instead. Integrate it into how we work with addiction and how we work with grief, how we work with stigma and discrimination. There was one core limitation to this study, and that's the fact that our sample was mostly bisexual women. And I feel like this limits generalizability to other aspects of the LGBTQ plus population, and limits the generalizability of our results to this community as a whole. Because of this, I feel like future research should recruit more diverse and intersectional samples and gain their perspectives on training as well. Finally, I think it'd be really interesting to evaluate different types of evaluate current training that includes lived experience perspectives, trauma-informed practice, and intersectional framework, and see if counsellors that have attended that training feel like they're more understanding and more able to work with this community, and also see what this community think of that training and see what they would change in that training. So, to conclude, this study centred LGBTQ plus voices to understand how counsellor training should be improved and to understand what to do to improve it. These findings showed that although many of our participants had positive counselling experiences, there was still uncertainty about counsellor competence and a lot of uncertainty about the training that counsellors complete to work with their community. Participants really emphasised that training should be mandatory and embedded across the curricula and not just an add-on that is optional for counsellors. They felt like training should focus on intersectionality and be trauma-informed as well. And they felt like there should be a counsellor focus on applied and affirming skills that are informed by lived experience and by people who identified as part of this community and struggled with their mental health. So one final message, I suppose a take-home message. This study really showed that LGBTQ plus clients don't just want an awareness of their community. They want counsellors who are trained on how to practice intersectional, applied and affirming care, who understand how to work with them and not just their identity in isolation. To do this, they felt like training needs to be integrated and not just an add-on, and this training needs to come from lived experience and from people who are part of this community and understand the intersectionality of this community and the complexity of the care that they need. So I want to say thank you very much for listening to me today, and if you have any questions, please feel free to give me a message or an email. Thank you.